that share, Joanne, how soon after you published the You song, you said that was, if I remember you correctly, that was a 30-year process, and then The Daughter of Jerusalem was a 10-year, if I got the books correct.
The other way around. Yeah, the
Daughter of
around.
Jerusalem was 30 years, and then the You song. Yeah. So The Daughter of Jerusalem was written first. I wanted to ask you, is The Daughter of Jerusalem, and to our off-the-shelf listeners, I hope you do hop over to Joanne Otto's website, and it's joanneotto.com, JoanneOtto.com, and check out the covers of her books and learn more about The Daughter of Jerusalem at Amazon. And while you're there, hopefully you'll purchase a copy. But what I wanted to ask you was, is The Daughter of Jerusalem, is the book based on a real person that you met?
Not a person that I met. The main character is fictional, but it revolves around actual events that are recorded in the Gospels. And I really wanted to be, not distorting anything that was in the Gospels, but to fit this fictional story in around it. In other words, I wanted anything that happened in the book to be something that could have happened, given what we know from the Gospels. And the main character is a young woman in her mid-teens, and I say woman because in those days she would have been considered a woman, and she would be marriageable at like 13 or 14. And that's something really for today's readers, to think about. And what had come to me way back was this girl having a very special relationship with her father, who is a Pharisee and a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, who met at the temple in Jerusalem. And he has no sons. And this little girl shows an interest in the holy books. And so he does something that kind of sets her outside the society she lives in. He starts teaching her the scriptures. And this is a big passion of hers. And the thought of getting married and having to do housework and children and all that is just, but that's what she's supposed to do. That's supposed to be her life. And so it's the story of what happens when a young rabbi from Galilee, whom we know as Jesus, who by the people of his time would have been called Yeshua, and Yeshua is the name he has in the book, because that's the Aramaic for Jesus. And he comes down to teach in Jerusalem at the temple, and she hears him. And so it's all about the impact that this has on her and on her family. So the basic story. And
well, women.
Yes.
So she, and that I knew. Well, you got married young back then. Were women? I know in the school women weren't supposed to speak in church and those types of things and teach. But were women not permitted to even read the scriptures back then?
They just would be considered a waste of time teaching them the scriptures. It wasn't like absolutely forbidden, but, why prepare a woman for that when she wasn't expected to do that? That just wasn't her role, So I don't think it was absolutely forbidden, but it wasn't encouraged at all.
Now this scene, you piqued my curiosity way, way up. So let me ask you this: how much research did you do in preparation for writing the Daughter of Jerusalem?
Well, part of it, since I was in the Bible all the time, every day, for decades, it was happening without necessarily being directed towards the book, right? I'm studying the scriptures for myself. But then, once I started thinking about writing the book, the big gap that I felt wasn't in knowing what happens in the Bible, but knowing what would everyday life have looked like back then, because I'm going to have to bring details into this story to make it come to life. So, what kind of everyday things are they going to be doing? And what would a woman have been allowed to do and not to do? What were the customs? And so all of this was what I felt I needed to do the most research on. And the interesting thing was, and I got a number of books. I visited websites and so forth, all kinds of things to kind of get the information. But I realized that I'd overloaded on information. And I started wondering, golly, can I really write a novel? I mean, can I really do this? It felt almost overwhelming because I had so much information. And finally, I sort of thought maybe I needed to turn this wonderful book idea over to somebody else to write, started doubting myself. And I called a friend who was a published author, and we had a lunch date. And I told her the story, and she absolutely loved it. And she said, I'd love to collaborate with you on it, but I can't do it now because I have a book contract, and I couldn't do anything before next year. And I said, what can I do in the meantime? And she said, write me an outline. Well, when that outline started coming, because outline, that sounds feasible, doesn't it? That doesn't sound quite so alarming. And so I started in on the outline, and it grew to about 11 very closely written pages. And I looked at the outline, and I thought, what if I start trying to flesh this out? And so I started writing, and it was wonderful. I really felt like God was directing the whole thing. And sometimes I would have written a chapter, and then the next morning during prayer, something would come to me, you've got to add this to that chapter, or something I'm wondering about, the solution for how to work it out would come to me. And it was just beautiful. I felt guided step by step through the whole thing. And when I finished it, I'm looking at it and I'm going, but it's only 88 pages long. and is it long enough? And then I thought of my students, my dyslexic students. This book is not going to intimidate them, is it? This is a nice short book, right? And then I thought of, I didn't think of this, but a young friend of mine who was a camp counselor, she could easily complete the reading of this book with her campers over a week or a 2-week stay.
There you go, Joanne.
At bedtime, and I've even read it to people in nursing homes, because I can read it to them in 2 days, right back to back, an hour and a half each day. I can read it out loud to them, and and they love it too. So it's really been wonderful. It's enabled it to be shared more, being the length it is. So it's all been just right. But yeah.
Can you? This question for the story, and then I want to ask you about Mara, the lead character in the story. But I wanted to ask you back then, when you think about Christ and you said her father was a Pharisee. How would you, if you were to compare them to, like in the church today or the Catholic Church, would they be, if they were in the Catholic Church, a Pharisee, you wouldn't be the Pope, but you would be, at what level in that would you be? And then in a more of a traditional Christian church, would you be like a bishop, her father? What would be comparable based on what your knowledge to what he in his level as a Pharisee? What would in other religions that be comparable?
this is an interesting question because the Pharisee wouldn't really fit into anything in the Christian tradition at all. They were more, the ones who did occupy priestly offices were the Sadducees. So, you had the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, both Sadducees and Pharisees sat on the council in the Sanhedrin. There were both. But the Sadducees were the ones who were they inherited their position. They had to be of the tribe of Levi. They were sort of a spiritual aristocracy. This is all different from our church, isn't it? I mean, it's not really like you don't inherit it and this kind of thing. But
right.
that was the Sadducees. But the Pharisees were like rabbis and teachers, and they worked really, really hard at following the law. And the law of God and the law of Moses, right? That was their big thing. And sometimes they got so carried away with it that they were kind of taking a checklist approach to virtue, right? And that is what Jesus took issue with them. But they were basically good people. And I think we forget that. We think the Pharisees were the bad guys.
Yes, yes.
A couple of Pharisees were the ones who gave Jesus a proper burial. There was no reason, somebody who'd been crucified was very often just left out there for the carrion birds to do away with, and these two Pharisees saw to it that he received a proper burial, and that took a lot of courage on their part, because to come out and let people know you were a follower of Jesus was not popular on the Sanhedrin, So, yeah. But they were good people, really, basically. Yeah, so that's one of the things I hope that the book will sort of overturn this negative, totally negative view of the Pharisees.
Yes.
Yes, they had their faults, but, yeah. And
now, so her father's a Pharisee, but she is taught, she meets Jesus, and it piques her interest. Does she... Because the Pharisees' Christ teaching was very, very different. They thought he was like, with reading the King James Version, he was blasphemous and like it was very wrong and like leading the people astray in their eyes. So here is this Mara, and her father's a Pharisee, and when Christ teaches her, does she now start to separate from her father? Because the teachings they don't seem the same. It's the same message, but the thing about Jesus' teaching that was so different was it wasn't based on book learning. There was an authority that was beyond that. And, she can't get over the combination of meekness and authority that she sees in him, because the Pharisees, they were proud, but their authority was kind of based on writings and other people and, that kind of thing, whereas Jesus, it was a holy, divine authority. And he was so meek because it was all the Father working through him. And, so this is what she sees, and it touches her very deeply. But each member of her family has their own take on Jesus. Each one kind of, has their own take. And so it causes some family conflict, yes. Mm-hmm. I can only imagine the father sticking to the law. It's Christ is talking about, like you said, not just sticking to the book. What he says within the book has spoken about him, but they couldn't see it. To know the law that well and not even see the person it was speaking about is astounding, at the least, absolutely astounding. Could you introduce us to Miss Mara? What is she like? I know you said she's curious. She's curious about the scriptures. This isn't something maybe that little girls normally do back then. But what are some of her passions, and what is her family like? Does she have siblings? What's it like for her growing up as a little girl?
Well, she has an older sister, and her name is Rachel. And, she loves Rachel very much, but Rachel's very different from her. Rachel is much more your traditional female of that era. And the story opens at Rachel's wedding, which, of course, brings all sorts of thoughts to Mara because, my goodness, Rachel's only 2 years older than me. This could be me. And,
Yes.
And, so it's a good place to kind of start. And so that's kind of the contrast there between the two sisters.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Mara is born, it becomes clear that the mother isn't going to be able to bear any more children. And so,
oh, okay.
So that's how her father knows he'll never have a son. And, so her interest really, it's satisfying to him too. I mean, he's taught other boys, as any Pharisee would, but to teach a child of his own just means so much to him. And so that's how Mara gets where she is. And she does. There is a very independent streak about her.
It seems like it.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
I like that.
It
seems like when you're talking about her, she's already wanting to do things that aren't common for girls during that time, and she's going after it, which is really is amazing. Now, one reviewer shared this about The Daughter of Jerusalem. Said Joanne Otto wrote Daughter of Jerusalem primarily for middle grade readers, but as an adult, I thoroughly enjoyed it too. Based on biblical references, the book is well written and acquaints the reader with some of the history of Jesus in a unique way through the eyes of Mara, a spunky, spirited young girl who appeals to modern-day readers. Now, this is my question to you. What do you think it is, Joanne, about Daughter of Jerusalem that also attracts adult readers?
Well, I think primarily it would attract adult readers who love the Bible. I think that's the key, because I don't think it would be of much interest to adult readers who don't care about the Bible. But a lot of people that I know do, and they have. And I want to mention one thing that's kind of unique about this, because you don't find this in the back of many works of fiction, but I felt it was so important to include some kind of a bridge to the Bible itself at the end of it, that I've put in references. So each place where something from the Bible comes into one of the chapters, I have put the references where they can find that in the Bible, in the back, in the appendix. And I put in discussion questions, which can be, wonderful for like a mother-daughter book club or some kind of a Christian book group. And then finally, I've put in an appendix, a glossary where they can look up words that they might not know what the Sanhedrin is, for instance. Or at one point, God is referred to as Hashem. Oh, Hashem, what's that? It's right there in the back. But Hashem actually means the name. And that's what they would have referred to God as in everyday conversation, because his name was so sacred that you weren't supposed to actually voice it out loud. And so they'd say the name, as if to say, you know who.
Wow.
So things like that. And so that's in the back. But it's not terribly complicated. You could read the book without ever looking at that and just enjoy it as a work of fiction. But if you want to use it for something more, it's there. So that was important.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And and thank you for sharing that. It sounds interesting. I may get a copy because it sounds like just the things it sounds like you could be almost a teacher to people when you, as many years as I've spent in church, and I've got 2 ministers in my family. Some of the stuff you've shared, I'm like, I never heard it put that way before. You simplify things that other people may complicate. And then also the story about the Pharisees, and when you started talking about them doing this off-the-shelf interview, I'm thinking, wow, she's actually making them, humanizing them, because most people think of Pharisees as very bad people, like they just were against Christ, and then you sort of fleshed them out and humanized them, which I do appreciate, and that could be a takeaway for people who do get a copy of The Daughter of Jerusalem, being that her father is actually a Pharisee. Now, what do you hope that readers gain from reading The Daughter of Jerusalem, Joanne? What do you want to see readers walk away with?
That's a good question. And I think a deeper appreciation of Jesus. And, because it's dedicated to all who love Yeshua, so, and also another, besides the Pharisees, there's another person in the Bible who for centuries has been assumed, not just assumed, to have been a prostitute, and that's Mary Magdalene. And she is actually a character. She's a character in this book. And so I hope people are going to walk away with that misconception of her cleared up, because there is a story of the woman washing Jesus' feet, but there's no name given to her in the Gospel of Luke, and Mary Magdalene is not introduced in the Gospel of Luke until the following chapter. So, there's no reason to assume they're the same person. And in fact, he had a number of female disciples who, as it's put, ministered unto him of their substance. In other words, they supplied his human needs because he was out there working for other people and not getting paid, So there were several, Susanna and Joanna, and Mary was one of them. So he had female disciples. And because those were the times when the Gospels were written, they don't get as much mention as the men disciples do. But they were there. And that was one of the things that was so unique about Jesus, because he treated them just as he would treat the men. They were just as important.
You should be a teacher. Oh, my goodness. I'm listening to you as many years as I've read the Bible, and I'm like, she needs to, your voice needs to be out here. So my goodness, you've taught, I said every guest teaches me something, and it's something that comes as a surprise. And you've taught a couple of things to me. I'm like sitting here listening to you with like, wow, all these years I never heard a minister or a pastor say some of the stuff you just said, ever.